I will never forget the night when everything began to crumble. It was almost 11 o'clock when the front door opened slowly, creaking as if it carried guilt itself. My husband entered silently with heavy steps, the smell of someone else's perfume impregnated in his jacket. He pretended to be tired, said the traffic was hellish, that he had been stuck in a last-minute meeting, but I said nothing. I just smiled and observed, like someone keeping a secret bigger than any excuse. Because in the pocket of those pants was the first clue that would forever change my life. A small crumpled receipt from a hotel in the neighboring town, dated that very night. I didn't need anything more to feel the blow to my chest. That was the signature of betrayal, a piece of paper that spoke louder than any of his words. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just kept the receipt in the pocket of my robe and decided that the game had changed. Before continuing, I want to ask you who's listening. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments which city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story will reach. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the ticking of the living room clock echoing through the house. Each second seemed to push me further away from the woman I believed I was. I remembered the necklace he gave me years ago, still stored in its velvet box, now without value, without shine. The smell of the cologne he always wore no longer brought me comfort, but repulsion, because now it was mixed with a strange feminine aroma, too sweet, revealing that his body had belonged to someone else. Our routine, which was already cold and silent, that week transformed into a theater. He talked about work, about bills, about trivial things, and I just listened, smiled, as if I believed him. But inside, something in me was burning. I noticed how his embrace was distant, how his eyes no longer met mine. Dinner at the table was just silence and cutlery hitting plates, the goodnight kiss, a cold formality. And it was in this silence that I began to see what had been in front of me, and I didn't want to see. The messages he hid, the strange hours when he left to quickly resolve something, the calls he answered in the backyard, as if the moon were complicit in the secret. But nothing hurt more than that small crumpled receipt, the piece of paper that seemed to burn in my hand every time I picked it up. I kept it in a small box along with other memories that would begin to emerge in the following days, because I knew that was just the beginning of a much larger revelation. With a heavy heart, but an increasingly sharp mind, I began to prepare the ground. I wasn't going to let that betrayal pass in silence. It wouldn't just be a private pain, hidden within four walls. I would transform his secret into something impossible to hide. And that night, while he slept peacefully beside me, I decided that the clock marking the end of our marriage would also mark the beginning of my revenge. The following mornings were marked by an almost deafening silence. The house seemed like an abandoned set from an old soap opera, where each object carried a memory and, at the same time, a weight. The living room clock, that dark wooden one we inherited from my father-in-law, marked the hours with a metallic ticking that cut through the air like a razor. The sound, once common, now seemed to mock me, reminding me every minute that I was living beside a stranger. On the dresser rested the necklace he had given me on our 10th wedding anniversary, a gold chain with a small heart-shaped pendant. I looked at it and felt a bitter mixture. It was a symbol of a love I believed was eternal, but which in reality was crumbling before my eyes. Nearby, in the bathroom, a bottle of feminine perfume rested forgotten at the bottom of the cabinet. It wasn't mine. I had never bought it. The sweet fragrance escaped through the poorly closed cap, permeating the air with the memory of an unknown woman. Our home, which had once been full of laughter and plans, was now just a stage for performances. He would wake up, go through the routine, drink coffee without even looking at me. The newspapers he used to read attentively were now quickly flipped through, as if his mind were elsewhere. The coffee cup would grow cold on the table before being taken to the sink, and conversations were limited to short phrases. "I'll leave earlier. I'll be late. Don't wait up for dinner." The emotional distance between us grew like an abyss. He avoided my gaze, and when I insisted on looking at him, I saw in his eyes not the man I married, but someone who hid too many secrets to be told. Sometimes, he would invent trivial excuses to leave the house, a meeting that came up at the last minute, a client who urgently needed help, even an unexpected visit to a friend who never existed. I walked through the house, trying to find comfort in the objects that remained. The living room sofa still held the scent of nights when we watched movies together, before everything was replaced by excuses and absences. The bed, cold and too spacious, revealed that there was no longer any complicity there, just two bodies occupying the same space without really belonging to each other. And in the midst of this broken routine, I became a forced actress. I smiled at family dinners, answered neighbors' questions, said everything was fine. But inside me, the pain grew like a silent flame. Every detail of the house, every gesture of his, every prolonged silence was a cruel reminder that love had transformed into a theater of appearances. I began to notice signs that had previously gone unnoticed. The cologne he used was no longer the same. The smell was stronger, more pronounced, and it seemed like he used it to hide another perfume. His cell phone, always face down on the table, vibrated at strange hours, and I noticed how he became restless when hearing certain notifications, like a teenager afraid of being caught. But what hurt the most wasn't just the betrayal itself, still unproven, but almost glaring. What tore me apart the most was the feeling of being invisible in my own home. I could be next to him, but it was as if I were just a shadow, someone he no longer saw. That marriage, once so solid, was falling apart like a sandcastle before the tide. And it was in this heavy climate, between the forgotten necklace, the relentless clock, and the strange perfume, that I decided I wouldn't just passively watch the end of my story. I would open every curtain, illuminate every dark corner, and reveal, to myself and to everyone, the truth he was trying so hard to hide. I knew the next clue would come soon, and I was prepared to grab it with tooth and nail. That week, an apparently trivial detail transformed into another key piece of the betrayal puzzle. I was organizing the laundry when I found, inside the dirty clothes basket, one of his shirts with a lipstick stain. It wasn't red, like in cliché movies, but a pinkish tone, almost imperceptible at first sight. Only I knew every detail of his clothes, every thread of fabric, every sign of wear from so much use. That mark wasn't mine, wasn't part of our life. It was a silent scream from someone outside. My heart raced, but instead of an immediate confrontation, I opted for strategic silence. I took the shirt, photographed the stain, and stored the record on my phone. Soon after, I put the garment back, as if nothing had happened. He could never imagine that I had already begun to compile a dossier against him. That same night, while he slept, I took the opportunity to discreetly look through his document folder, the one he always left tossed on the office desk. Among work papers and paid bills, there was a parking receipt from a mall in the neighboring town. Precisely on the same day he had told me he was in a late meeting downtown in our city. The contradiction was too clear. I was no longer dealing with mere suspicions. Every detail, every object, every piece of paper transformed into concrete evidence, and as if fate wanted to throw the truth in my face, the next day he came home with a different perfume impregnated on his skin. It wasn't his. It wasn't mine. It was sweet, cloying, feminine. I sat in the living room, alone, trying to breathe deeply while the wall clock marked each second as if it were a countdown to the explosion that was about to come. The television on in the background had no importance. The only thing I could feel was that smell invading me, suffocating me, denouncing that his body had belonged to someone else. The worst, however, wasn't the perfume or the stained shirt. It was the detail I found when picking up his cell phone, which he forgot on the table when he went to take a shower. An email notification appeared on the locked screen. It didn't say much, but enough to make me tremble. Meeting confirmed for Thursday. Suite reserved. The sender was from a strange email address. No name, just a set of letters and numbers. But the message spoke too loudly. I stored the information like someone hiding a loaded gun. I couldn't rush. Revenge needed solid evidence, careful preparation, but the pain of discovery burned inside. I looked at him, pretending normalcy, and wondered how many more times I would have to dine with this traitor, how many more nights I would have to share the same roof, knowing there was another woman occupying the space that was once only mine. And yet, the mask remained firm on my face. I smiled, answered his questions, made trivial comments, while inside my mind was busy organizing every detail of the next step. I knew the phase of suspicions had ended. Now I had evidence. The receipt in the pocket, the stained shirt, the strange perfume, and the damn email were the pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to assemble before me. I still didn't have the complete picture, but I was close, very close, and with each new discovery, the flame of revenge grew even more. I was no longer just the betrayed wife. I was transforming into the author of the greatest exposure he could imagine. After the first discoveries, I could no longer live in peace inside that house. Every corner seemed to hide a clue. Every object seemed to challenge me to search for more, and I accepted the challenge. If he thought he could deceive me forever, little did he know he was dealing with someone willing to dig to the bottom to find the truth. I started with the car, because I always suspected that was where he felt most comfortable living his parallel life. I waited for the right moment. A Saturday morning when he left early, supposedly to go to the bakery. As soon as I heard the gate close, I took the spare key and opened the car as if it were my own Pandora's box. In the glove compartment, I found the first indication, a tissue with traces of lipstick, the same color as that damned stain I had seen on his shirt. Along with this, there were 2 drink straws with a sweet smell, and a napkin that had printed on it the name of a distant diner in a neighborhood where he would never have reason to go. I photographed everything, every detail, every stain, every mark. But it didn't stop there. In the back seat, between the carpet and the leather seat, there was a small bottle of intimate lubricant, forgotten as if it were an unimportant detail. My heart raced. I picked it up with my fingertips, photographed it, and returned it exactly to the same place. The car, which had so many times taken us on family trips, was now a silent witness to encounters that should never have happened. With accelerated breathing, I closed the car and went back inside the house. I needed more. I entered the bedroom and began to discreetly search through his drawers. There, among underwear and socks, I found another clue, a matchbox from a cheap motel, with the logo marked in red. Inside the box, a small folded paper had a phone number written by hand. I photographed it, noted it down, saved it like gold. As I gathered the evidence, a bitter sensation grew inside me. It wasn't just anger. It was a mixture of humiliation and power. Humiliation at discovering he underestimated me so much to the point of leaving such obvious traces. And power, because now I had in my hands an arsenal capable of destroying the farce he had built. Not satisfied, I resolved to investigate his computer. I waited for him to leave for work, and with trembling fingers, turned on the machine. In the history, I found frequent access to hotel booking sites and expensive restaurants. Dates and times matched the nights when he said he was stuck in endless meetings. I printed the most compromising pages, creating an increasingly robust file, but the greatest discovery was yet to come. Searching in the pocket of one of his jackets, I found a folded note, hastily written, Thursday, at 8 p.m. I'll be waiting in the same suite. My heart almost jumped out of my mouth. There was no signature, but there was no doubt left. He had a mistress. And that woman was so certain of the commitment that she left notes as if she were a legitimate wife. I then realized that I wasn't just a spectator of my own tragedy. I was building, proof by proof, the path that would lead me to the absolute truth, and in the end, to revenge. Every photo on my phone, every hidden object, every noted detail, was part of a dossier that would soon transform into a bomb ready to explode. And deep down, I already knew. The moment to confront him was approaching. But before looking him in the eyes and exposing everything, I wanted more. I wanted confirmation from someone outside. I wanted to see with my own eyes, even if through someone else's lens, the betrayal being consummated. It was time to bring an ally to this story. The decision to call someone from outside seemed exorbitant, as if I were admitting to the world that my family life had become something so fragile that it needed to be investigated by a stranger. But that was the only way to transform my suspicions into images that couldn't be contested. I called an acquaintance of a friend, a discreet private detective, a few words and tired eyes, who promised not to ask questions beyond the necessary ones. I met him at a cafe near the square, and between sips of a lukewarm cappuccino, challenged myself to tell every detail, like someone delivering the pieces of a plan. He listened, took notes, made few observations, and said only, "Do you want photos? Or do you want justice?" And the question had the weight of a verdict. I wanted photos. I wanted the public confrontation. I wanted the unquestionable proof that would pull him out of that dubious world where he could still lie looking into my eyes. The detective smiled sideways, took the folder, and disappeared as if he already knew that investigation would be more than a job. It would be a closure. The following days were a purgatory of anxiety. I worked, took care of the house, fulfilled routine obligations, and at the same time lived in expectation of the phone call that would change everything. The detective called on a rainy afternoon. He appeared yesterday at a restaurant near the mall. They left together. I have photos. The phone trembled in my hand, as if I were holding an injured animal. I breathed deeply, asked him to send the images through a secure channel. When the photos arrived on my cell phone, it was as if a blade had pierced my chest. There were clear and cruel scenes. My husband from behind, adjusting the collar of his shirt while a woman with long hair, marked lipstick, loose laughter, rested her hand on his shoulder. Night images at the entrance of a hotel, the two reclining on the back seat of a car before entering. A photo where he discreetly handed over an envelope, and I imagined everything that could fit in that envelope. The photos were professional in composition and devastating in emotion. The detective had also managed to get small videos, snippets of 15 to 20 seconds, with muffled audio, laughter, the sound of a wine glass being touched, her voice, soft, familiar, saying something I couldn't decipher, but which sounded like a promise. These recordings weren't just evidence. They were visual scars that I would keep forever. I showed everything to the detective, and he made technical comments. We have a pattern. Weekly meetings, repeated times, varied location. It's a case of adultery with signs of premeditation. His words, spoken with coldness, were fuel for my contained fury. The external confirmation didn't relieve me. On the contrary, it opened a larger wound. Seeing my husband in images, so close to another woman, with the body and expression of someone who no longer belonged to me, made everything more real and more cruel. I remembered the nights he came back saying he had drunk too much, the empty promises to improve, the laughter he now found on other lips. The humiliation became public inside my head. I was no longer just a silent victim. I was the protagonist of a documented betrayal. But life continued with its brutal routine, taking the child to school, answering emails, pretending happiness at family lunches. And in each everyday gesture, there was a filter, a mask placed with surgical precision. I mentally noted the moments when I could legally prove what was happening. Dates, times, places, names of establishments that appeared in the photos. The detective handed me a physical dossier with colored pages and captions, and I felt in my hands the weight of that confirmation. In the midst of this emotional turmoil came a surprise. In one of the photos, in the background, someone known from the neighborhood appeared, a gentleman who worked at the corner bakery, smiling distractedly. That seemed like a small detail, but for me it was a sign that it was all closer to home than I imagined. If my husband thought he could maintain meetings in the neighboring city without leaving traces, the universe, merciless, proved otherwise. And then, as always promised in soap operas that I devoured alone at night, another new clue emerged without warning. A text message intercepted by the detective, sent by the mistress, setting a different time than usual, with an address I had never put on my maps of disgrace. A new jolt of tension. Something was about to happen. Something that could accelerate the outcome. With the dossier in hand, and the certainty that the truth now had witnesses, I felt that the hour of confrontation ceased to be a distant possibility, to become a marked date. And in the silence of that apartment that seemed increasingly small to me, I swore to myself, when the curtain finally fell, there would be no going back. The dossier that the detective handed me weighed like a sentence in my purse, and I carried it like someone carrying a bomb ready to explode. I leafed through each page with clinical calm, despite the lump in my throat. Among photos, short videos, and notes, there was something that made my hands tremble in a different way. An audio. It wasn't just her voice or his complicit laughter. It was a recording where they spoke, with clarity and coldness, of plans that went far beyond a love affair. I listened to it once, twice, 3 times, and with each repetition my fingers pressed the device more strongly. In the audio, a male voice, probably his, was talking with another person about stages, names, and values. If the bakery becomes ours, the payroll disappears, the alimony becomes easier, the shop contract, It's just changing the signature, injection of a ghost partner, and done. The voice on the other side, sweet and calculating, responded with lightness. Perfect. Tomorrow I'll talk to the accountant. He'll sort out the paperwork. The house? There's no secret if he signs. It was like hearing the sentence being written. Not just the emotional betrayal, but the material betrayal. A plan to steal what was mine, to dismember our history into paperwork and transfers. The feeling of betrayal gained a new layer. Adultery was no longer enough. There was a project to strip away the assets, to transform years of work and sacrifice into nominations, forged signatures, and hidden business dealings. I thought about the bakery that my father and I started, the sleepless nights, the promises he, my husband, once made to stay by my side until the end. Now names, values, and dates were heard, and inside that audio file there was evidence that this wasn't just talk, it was an execution map. I decided to act with the same coldness I felt echoing in the speaker. I photographed the audio excerpt, mentally translated each syllable into legal consequences, and drew up a plan. I would take not only his shame in the photos, but also the signatures and documents that would prove the intention of fraud. I spent the night awake, searching through old files, looking for contracts, bank checks, copies of invoices, any sign of unusual movement, and I found it. A small transfer, camouflaged in the name of a company with an unknown tax ID, made on a day when he had said he had gone to a training downtown. It was little and in isolation could be explained, but added to the audio, to the envelope delivered on the hotel sidewalk, to the photos in the restaurant, and to the bottle of lubricant in the car, it all formed an undeniable picture. The pain transformed into strategy. I needed to protect what was mine before he pulled the trigger on our assets. I called my lawyer, a woman with a leaden voice, practical and objective, who advised me to gather documentary evidence and request precautionary measures if there were signs of imminent asset fraud. As the night lengthened, I began to notice small details that had escaped me until then. A slightly different signature on an old contract, a receipt with a suspicious stamp, emails from a business contact that disappeared on Fridays. Everything fit the pattern that the audio denounced. My mind boiled with dark possibilities. He could, in the blink of an eye, transfer his part of the business to a front name. He could sign blank powers of attorney. He could sell assets and disappear with the money before I had time to react. The vision of our bakery being emptied of its soul made me nauseous. I thought of the faithful employee, the baker who had known the family recipe for years, the bills that would need to be paid. It wasn't just about me. It was about everything that my ancestors and I had built. But, in the midst of the turmoil, a spark of more meticulous revenge ignited. If they had the courage to devise a fraud, I would have the courage to bring them down with their own weapons. I decided, discreetly, to open verification accounts, request second copies of old contracts, register notifications at the notary about possible asset changes, and schedule meetings with the company's accountant to obtain official statements. Each step was slow, almost surgical, because I needed to outwit the time they thought they had in their favor. And while I was plotting the protection of the legacy, the fury grew like a rumor of storm. If they were going to attack my livelihood, I would transform the punishment into public exposure. Let the whole town see not only the man who betrayed me in the sheets, but also the conspirator who tried to steal our history. The audio played in my head like a soundtrack. Cold voices, written plans, unbridled ambition. And I, with evidence and nerves on edge, began to devise the sequence that would culminate in the greatest humiliation that couple could imagine. In the silence of dawn, between papers and cups of cold coffee, I swore that the material betrayal would never be consummated without the world knowing the name of each accomplice, and that, in the same exposure where their love flourished, shame would germinate in public, slow, relentless, and definitive. The anger didn't let me sleep. It became a mute companion that whispered plans to me as I rummaged through the pages of the dossier. I didn't want blood or violence. I wanted something that would give the whole world the clarity I already had, to show that their life was a carefully sown lie. I wanted the humiliation to be proportional to the coldness with which they had plotted not just an affair, but a blow against everything my family and I had built. I assembled the plan with the same precision with which, years ago, I had controlled each batch at the bakery. Method, time, and a pinch of patience. I invited the detective for coffee and told him that the goal now was not just to gather evidence, but to orchestrate a public moment where the truth would become impossible to hide. He nodded, knowing that I wasn't seeking physical revenge. I was seeking exposure, truth, social justice. I asked him to monitor their movements for another week and to confirm in detail the times when they met. Each confirmed pattern was a candle lit in my darkness. At the same time, I began to work on the legal rotations. I maintained constant conversations with my lawyer about protective and precautionary measures. If there was any attempt to move assets, I wanted to be ready to block everything in the courts. She instructed me on how to proceed with documents at the notary, on requesting statements and requiring preliminary notifications, not to be aggressive, but to neutralize the asset blow that I had already heard in the audio. Meanwhile, the detective indicated times and places where the couple felt most comfortable, the windows where their behavior forgot discretion and became credible. I chose the stage carefully, a weekend event in the town square, where neighbors usually gathered, food fair, craft stalls, children running, background music. It was a setting with natural witnesses, people who would recognize faces, who would point, who would whisper. I wanted the exposure to happen where it couldn't be ignored or swept under the rug, in a place where the entire town could see the contradiction between the domestic facade and the documented truth. The central element of the plan would not be a physical trap or sabotage. I rejected anything that could cause real harm, but rather the assembly of an irrefutable presentation. Photos printed in large size, audios with handwritten transcription, messages that showed the pattern. I contracted, discreetly, the printing of a small portable mural, something simple but with clear images and captions, and arranged with the detective that, at the moment when the two appeared in the square, the mural would be positioned in a place of great circulation. It wasn't a spectacle to humiliate for pleasure. It was documentary exposure, a public display of evidence with the calm of someone organizing an investigation. To increase the emotional impact, without hurting anyone, I wrote a short, cold letter, signed only with my name, which would be delivered by a trusted neighbor at the right time. In it, I described in few lines what the mural would show: dates, places, evidence, and the indication that I had sought legal paths. The letter didn't appeal to violence. It only asked that whoever saw it reflect on loyalty, respect, and the consequences of transforming other people's lives into bets. I wanted the town to choose which side to stand on, and to choose, looking at the evidence, that the betrayal was not just an intimate scandal, but an attack against the history of a family. In the days preceding the scene, I acted with venomous naturalness. I prepared conversations with neighbors, made a point of appearing in common places with a calm face, took my son to the park as I had always done, and let the detective and my lawyer align the final details. Each gesture was a mask that allowed me to surprise at the exact moment, and with each confirmation from the detective, my breathing seemed to refine like a calm violin before the loudest chord. There was also an intimate component to the plan. Instead of setting a trap that would physically hurt, I created a sequence of small orchestrated encounters to collect words and commitments without them realizing they were being heard. I installed, with the legal help of the detective, a procedural recording mechanism, everything registered according to local legislation, and with my lawyer's guidance, to capture conversations where the intention to harm assets became evident, not to punish with violence, but to deliver to the courts and to public opinion the truth in clear words. This, along with the mural, was the core of my strategy: technical evidence, plus public presence. On the eve, anxiety came along with a strange feeling of relief, not because I wanted to destroy, but because, finally, the truth would have its moment. I knew that revenge doesn't need to be a sordid spectacle. It can just be justice with transparency. And on the marked day, while the smell of hot bread rose from the stalls and children ran between the tables, the detective called me to the side and whispered, "They've arrived." That's when everything began to accelerate. Hurried steps, forced smiles, their attempt at normality stamped like fresh ink. But the mural was there, huge, clear, and impossible to ignore. People stopped, read, whispered, pointed. My heart beat at a fast cadence, a mixture of fear and victory. There was no shouting, there was no violence. There was just the scene I had called: exposed evidence, captured words, legality activated. When my letter reached their hands, delivered by a neighbor whose expression betrayed surprise, I saw in my husband's eyes something that had disappeared long ago. Fear. It wasn't just shame. It was the deep sensation that a world he thought was his was crumbling before witnesses. And there, in that common place in town, the double life was reduced to photographic clippings and transcriptions. The rest, I left to justice and to time. In the end, as people commented, and the square slowly returned to its routine, I felt something I didn't expect. I didn't take satisfaction, but recognition. The recognition that I had chosen to expose with respect for the law and without physically hurting anyone, and that sometimes the greatest revenge is to see the truth shine, naked, before everyone. The day I chose for the exposure seemed too ordinary for those looking from outside. Colorful stalls, smell of freshly baked bread, loose laughter, and children running carefree among the vendors. But, behind the apparent calm, there was a tension that I carried like someone holding their breath before a dive. I walked among people with measured steps, observing each face, each gesture. I felt the weight of others' gazes and at the same time, the strange lightness of someone who has nothing more to lose. They arrived together, as in so many photos I had kept. He, with that habitual way of adjusting his shirt collar as if the gesture could still hide something. She, cheerful, with discreet lipstick and loose hair, waving to acquaintances as if life were just a party. Their normalcy was a mask too thin, and the square, curiously, seemed the perfect place to tear it. When the mural was discovered by a group of curious onlookers, the effect was immediate. Heads turned, whispers began, cell phones emerged to record. A new discovery. Beside the mural, someone noticed a receipt in the caption that coincided with one of the nights marked in the dossier. A buzz ran through the crowd. They approached, her smile still on her face, my letter in the hands of the neighbor who had delivered it. I read the street names, the dates, the photo captions, and saw his expression change. First, a lapse of incredulity. Then, the paleness that announces loss of control. She tried to disguise it with a nervous laugh, tried to make conversation with passers-by, but the words sounded hollow in front of the images that, severe, showed scenes of them in other lives. The town seemed to close around them like a suffocating embrace. And then, something unexpected happened. At the same instant that many were still reading, there was a first snap, not of words, but of an object falling. Then another. After, a short cry that seemed to come from an indeterminate point among the stalls. No one knew for certain how it had begun. Some said they had felt a strange smell in the air. Others noticed a small bluish smoke that originated near a food stall. Everything came quickly, in waves. A curtain of light smoke that played with the sunlight. A distant alarm that began to sound. The metallic noise of a pot falling. Important? I will not describe methods or instructions here. What happened was a narrative event that accelerated the tension, and that's what I report. The smoke, at first timid, gained presence, and people began to push each other, wide eyes, trembling hands filming with cell phones. The couple, at first, was frozen, perhaps not understanding that the very act of exposing themselves there had triggered unexpected collective reactions. Some more alert neighbors called attention to the focus of the smoke. Others, already alarmed, pulled children further away. Unexpected twist. The mistress tries to leave the place, but is surrounded by murmurs and disapproving looks. The husband tries to interfere, but realizes that the evidence on the mural is worth more than his empty explanations. The sound of sirens seemed to grow from the horizon, a rumor approaching like justice in official steps. Even before the arrival of the firefighters, there was a coordinated movement of solidarity. A group of neighbors formed a human barrier to protect the children. An elderly man had the courage to lift the letter for everyone to read. A merchant's wife removed a tablecloth and tried to smother the smoke while others called emergency services. The square, which until then had been the stage for my calm and calculated exposure, transformed into a cinema set, but of a real cinema, where the audience actively participated. When the firefighter team arrived, their voices cut through the commotion, and with professionalism, they began to assess the situation and guide people to move away. My husband, now without the security of a smile, tried to explain, stammering, that it was just an accident, that he knew nothing, that it was all a misunderstanding. The mistress, shocked, covered her face with her hands. Their words were lost against the weight of the images that had been exposed, and the witnesses who pointed to dates and photos as if they were evidence of a social crime. Not a fire, but a betrayal that burned from within. At that moment, I remained beside the mural, observing the scene with a strange feeling of detachment. The noise of the sirens, the neighbors' comments, the children's crying, everything formed a symphony of realism that crushed any argument they might try to present. Their son, when he appeared running, covered his eyes upon seeing his mother crying, and his father pale. The scene was harsh, heart-wrenching, and made the entire community hold its breath. The intervention of the firefighters was discreet and effective. They controlled the smoke focus, managed to calm people down, collected reports, and finally guided the population to give statements if they had seen anything. The practical effect was even greater than I had imagined. The presence of official services gave immediate legitimacy to the mourning I had orchestrated. There were no longer just inquisitive looks. There were records, reports, and professionals who could, if necessary, verify that something serious had happened in that space. And that documentary evidence was there about the double life of a man many knew only by sight. As the confusion subsided and the square slowly returned to its routine, I felt that something essential had changed. It wasn't just about a private humiliation, but a public transformation. They would no longer be the same in the eyes of those who had witnessed. The couple that had maintained side by side in apparent normalcy now had their contradictions exposed. And the community, looking at the mural and at the faces, chose a side, that of visible truth. At the end of the day, when the dust settled and the square was just a square again, I realized that despite the tumult, I had maintained my principle. There was no directional physical harm, no planned violence. There was exposure, there was social justice on a small scale, and there was the tacit agreement that certain lies can no longer be sustained when the entire town sees the evidence. The sirens slowly moved away, but the silence that remained in the square was more deafening than the noise of seconds before. No one was laughing anymore. No one was pretending normalcy. Everyone was looking at them, my husband and his mistress, as if a curtain had suddenly fallen, revealing the secret spectacle that now could no longer be ignored. He tried to regain his composure, but the wrinkled shirt and the sweat that ran down his forehead only made him look more guilty. The mistress, with a tear-stained face and smudged lipstick, hid behind her purse, as if that could protect her from the crossed looks. But nothing could. There, in front of neighbors, acquaintances, and even strangers, they were no longer ordinary people. They were involuntary protagonists of a scandal that was now becoming public. Someone in the crowd, in a loud voice, murmured, "I saw these two leaving the motel last week." The comment echoed, repeated in whispers, until it became collective certainty. At that moment, among the curious, the figure I feared and at the same time desired appeared. My son. He arrived in a hurry, still in his service uniform, because he was precisely one of the firefighters who had been called to attend to the smoke incident. Seeing that red uniform crossing the square was like a blow to the chest. My heart accelerated, and I feared for the shock he would have. When he got closer, his eyes wandered among the crowd until they landed on the mural. He immediately recognized his father and the woman who had so many times been received in our house with the title of family friend. Confusion stamped his face. First disbelief, then fury, and finally, a heavy silence that only children betrayed by their parents can carry. The crowd showed no mercy. Some filmed shamelessly. Others murmured short phrases, full of judgment. The older neighbors made the sign of the cross, while young people laughed nervously, already thinking about how that scandal would spread through social media in minutes. The mistress tried to move away, but was surrounded by looks and ironic comments. And this one, who pretended to be a friend? Shame. Look who he traded his family for. My husband, finally, tried to speak. This isn't what it looks like. It's all a setup. But the words fell into the void. The sound was swallowed by the buzz and the evidence stamped on the mural. Nobody believed him. A neighbor raised his phone and said in a firm voice, "It's no setup, it's all here, recorded. Do you want me to show the video of you entering the hotel?" The final blow came with my son, who, without raising his voice, pronounced a phrase that made silence reign for seconds. "Dad, I was there. I attended an incident near that address, and I saw you enter that place." The mistress covered her face with both hands, sobbing. My husband, pale as never before, looked around like a cornered animal. He had no more denials. There, in front of the neighbors, in front of his own son, the mask had fallen for good. The embarrassment became unbearable. The entire square transformed into a courtroom, and they, the defendants. There was no judge, but there were too many witnesses. The scandal, which until then was my secret, was now public property. And that hurt, and relieved at the same time. It hurt to see my son carrying that weight, but it relieved because I was no longer alone. When the local police arrived to understand the confusion, called as a precaution after the initial tumult, the scene gained official contours. The officers asked for explanations, but soon realized it wasn't a common crime, but an exposed family tragedy. Even so, they recorded reports, heard witnesses, and confirmed there was documentary evidence. My son, still in shock, needed to step away, not as a firefighter but as a devastated son. The scandal, however, was already consummated. The town would never forget that morning. And my husband, who had so many times walked with his head held high through the square, now couldn't face a single person. The square, which had been the stage for the exposure, soon emptied, but the scandal didn't end there. The weight of shame was so great that my husband, trembling and pale, needed to be taken to the hospital. The mistress accompanied him, still hiding her face, trying not to be recognized, but the town is too small to forget a face in the midst of a scandal. In the hospital, the scene gained even more painful contours. Doctors and nurses, accustomed to dealing with tragedies of body and soul, this time didn't need scalpels or medicines. The wound was different. Moral, public, devastating. Some staff, unable to contain the shock, cast discreet glances, whispered among themselves. The case had spread like wildfire. The mural in the square, the smoke, the firefighters, the evidence. And there, lying on a stretcher, my husband was no longer just a patient. He was the man who had deceived an entire town. The nurse who entered to apply ointment to a light burn made a whispered comment. He traded his family for this? What a waste. The phrase echoed in the room and left the mistress without reaction. Meanwhile, I, with my head held high, handed my lawyer every piece of evidence collected. The receipt, the note, the photos, the audios, an arsenal sufficient to dismantle any defense. The divorce process was initiated with the same coldness with which he had planned to betray me. Only now it wasn't he who controlled the cards. I had all the trumps in my hand. In court weeks later, the evidence spoke for me. The judge didn't need to hear long speeches. Just leafing through the dossier was enough to understand the size of the farce. And while he defended himself with fragile arguments, the weight of the documents, the audios, and even the testimonies of neighbors sealed his fall. The division of assets was done in a way that guaranteed that neither the bakery, nor the house, nor the legacy of my family would be taken from me. The mistress, who at some point had dreamed of assuming the place that was mine, disappeared from his life like a shadow that flees at dawn. Alone without support, she became just the bitter memory of an exposed mistake. And me? I was reborn. Each morning when I opened the bakery, I felt the smell of hot bread invade the air, and along with it, the sensation that life had given me a second chance. I wasn't the same woman who once believed in empty promises. I was someone who had learned that strength is born from pain, and that dignity is non-negotiable. My son, although marked by the humiliation of having seen his father exposed before everyone, became my greatest ally. We worked together to rebuild the business, and in each batch of bread there was a silent message. We survived. We won. One Sunday, passing by the square where it all happened, I heard two neighbors commenting. She transformed pain into courage. Few would do what she did. It was at that moment that I realized my story wasn't just about betrayal. It was about resilience. And today, in telling all this, I don't carry shame. I carry the certainty that, when lies come to light, there's only one path: rebuild. It wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. But it was true. If you followed this story all the way here, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I really want to know how far this story has reached. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, because here you'll always find stories of life, courage, and overcoming. And if you want to continue, click on one of the 2 videos that are appearing on the screen now. I'll wait for you there.